She stepped off the train in her best shawl, heart racing, only to hear him mutter, "You didn't say you were this old," before walking away without a word. Laughter erupted behind her, sharp, cruel, teenage, and still, she didn't cry. Not yet. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind met Evelyn Carter before the townspeople did. It caught the edge of her shawl as she stepped off the train, lifting its lace like a fragile flag, not of surrender, but of arrival. The platform was sun-bleached and quiet, dust swirling around her boots like restless ghosts. Her gloved hands clutched a modest suitcase, brown leather, scuffed at the corners, packed with hand-stitched linens and a heart full of trembling hope. She stood straighter than her age might suggest, chin gently lifted, eyes scanning a town she'd only seen in her mind, shaped by letters, by cursive dreams on yellowed paper. Henry had written with care, with warmth even, in a hand that favored straight lines and decisive ink. He'd spoken of wanting peace, companionship, a kind of love that doesn't wear out. Evelyn, alone in her candle-lit kitchen on those long Missouri nights, had believed he meant her. She'd replied in sentences laced with humility and honest detail, her skill with patchwork, her fondness for books, the strength in her arms from years of kneading dough and lifting burdens without complaint. She had not lied, but neither had she declared her age in bold letters. 64, yes, but steady, solid. A woman with breath left in her chest and tenderness still warm in her hands. When the train hissed and rolled away behind her, leaving only the taste of coal in the air, she saw him. Henry, broad-shouldered, neatly dressed, hat in hand. His jaw tightened the moment their eyes met. He blinked, once, slowly, then narrowed his gaze as if trying to bring her into sharper focus, hoping perhaps that she would transform before his eyes. She didn't. "You didn't say you were this old," he said. The words struck her not like a slap, but like cold water on a wound. Not violent, but purifying in its cruelty. His tone was restrained, as if pity might soften the sting. It didn't. She saw now that the man who had spoken so gently on paper wanted something to adore, not something to respect. She stood still, breath caught just below her collarbone. In that moment, her dreams didn't shatter. They simply deflated, folding in on themselves like paper left in the rain. Henry turned. No farewell, no apology. Just the sound of his boots growing fainter with each step, until the wind returned, brushing her cheek like a hand too late to matter. The sun bore down with quiet cruelty as Evelyn stood rooted on the wooden platform, her fingers clenched around the worn leather handle of her suitcase. Around her, life resumed its pace as though nothing had happened. A freightman whistled as he rolled a cart of crates, a boy chased a dog across the depot, and a mother called for her daughter from the dry goods store. Only Evelyn stood still, as if the heat itself had turned her to stone. Henry was gone. No carriage, no parting glance. The man who had signed each letter with "Yours in Hope" had vanished with nothing but a rustle of coat and the soft crunch of his heels in the gravel. She had arrived as someone's future and was now left with nothing but her past, and a platform full of strangers. Behind her, laughter sparked like firecrackers. She turned just enough to see them. 3 girls in calico dresses no older than 17, standing beneath the shade of the station awning. One smirked, brushing a honey-colored curl from her cheek, and said to the others, "Maybe she thought it was a grandmother ad." The others snickered in chorus, casting sideways glances as if her presence alone offended them. Evelyn didn't flinch, didn't fire back, didn't run. She merely adjusted her shawl as though shielding herself from something colder than the sun, and walked. Her boots, cracked at the toes, struck the dirt road with steady rhythm. She didn't know where she was going. There was no address, no plan. Just one slow step after another, past a saloon buzzing with flies and indifference, past a chapel with a crooked bell tower, past a butcher's shop with meat sweating in the window. Her legs ached with each mile, but her spine stayed straight. It was late afternoon by the time she reached a brick building with peeling green shutters and a crooked wooden sign that read Gideon's Mercantile. A kind-eyed woman sweeping the stoop looked up and said nothing at first, only took in Evelyn's wind-blown hair, the scuffed bag, the look in her eyes. Then she opened the door. That night, Evelyn sat in a small room above the shop, wallpaper faded, bed clean but stiff. She loosened the bodice of her travel dress and reached beneath the neckline, pulling out the blue ribbon she had sewn in just that morning, a flutter of foolishness tied with quiet hope. She stared at it for a long moment, then folded it with deliberate care and placed it in the bottom drawer of the nightstand beneath the Gideon Bible. It felt less like removing an accessory and more like closing a chapter. She did not pray that night. She simply lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening to the creak of the ceiling beams, and the silence where a welcome should have been. The town learned her story in the way small towns always do, not from her lips, but from the soft hum of speculation that traveled faster than trains. "She came for a man," they said over fence rails and under porch roofs, but he took one look and left her standing like an old boot at the door. Her name passed between neighbors like a hand-me-down coat, reshaped, reworded, never asked for. Some regarded her with that syrupy pity reserved for those deemed past their prime. They spoke to her slowly, as though kindness could be measured in condescension. Others simply watched from behind lace curtains, waiting for her to crack, for the rejection to bloom into public collapse. But Evelyn Carter did not collapse. Each morning she swept the floor above Gideon's shop with measured strokes, as though dust were the only thing in her life that could be controlled. She pressed the iron hard into the seams of old clothes, the hiss of steam her only reply to the gossip that gathered like soot in corners. When Mrs. Ruth McAllister offered her work, hemming linens, mending children's trousers, sewing on missing buttons by oil lamp, Evelyn accepted with a nod and a soft thank you. Not because she needed charity, but because she needed purpose. She never once uttered Henry Whitlock's name. When a neighbor leaned in with well-meaning eyes and said, "It's a shame what happened," Evelyn smiled, warm and distant, and replied, "I'm grateful to have found a roof." And that was all. Her silence was not weakness, it was choice, a shield drawn with needle and thread, with the smell of fresh bread cooling on the windowsill, with small acts of usefulness that turned her pain into something someone else might need. Children began to linger near the mercantile in hopes of a slice of molasses cake. Travelers left with hand-stitched satchels or patchwork quilt squares she tucked into their saddlebags for warmth. One elderly widow brought her a spool of blue thread without comment, just placed it on the counter and nodded. Soon, folks stopped calling her the one who got left. They called her Miss Carter, the quiet one, the kind one, the one who helps without being asked. And in a town where whispers could strip a soul bare, Evelyn had managed something rare. She reclaimed her name without ever raising her voice. The church hall smelled faintly of hymnals and old wood polish, the kind that lingered in the seams of the floorboards and whispered of 100 potlucks and whispered prayers. Every Sunday, Evelyn took the same seat, second row from the back, far enough not to intrude, close enough to listen. She kept her hands folded on her lap and nodded politely when spoken to, her shawl wrapped tight even on warm days, like armor stitched from memory. And every Sunday, without fail, there was the man. He stood near the rear double doors, leaning against the wainscoting like he wasn't quite meant to be there. Tall, broad-shouldered, arms crossed, boots dusty. He never sang, never bowed his head during the blessings. But he listened. Not like someone fulfilling a duty. Like someone clinging to the echo of a voice that used to be there. Daniel Reeves. Most folks didn't say his name out loud anymore. His story was too sharp around the edges. He'd been a carpenter once, built the altar platform himself before his wife took sick and never recovered. Since then, he'd stopped building anything that wasn't necessary, sold off his team of horses, shut the workshop doors, lived in a cabin on the ridge where no one went unless they needed something fixed and didn't mind the silence. But Evelyn noticed that he watched her. Not in the way of men weighing a woman's shape or measuring her usefulness. No, Daniel watched the way people watched fragile things they were afraid to touch. The way someone stares at a candle in a room full of wind, careful, reverent, afraid to breathe too close. He never approached, not for weeks, until one afternoon, long after the final hymn had faded, Evelyn stepped outside and realized her shawl was missing. She hadn't heard him approach. His footsteps were soft, careful, as though he'd learned how to carry grief without making noise. "You left this," he said, holding out the folded shawl with both hands, the lace corners aligned with exacting care. Evelyn reached for it, her fingers brushing his, calloused, warm, but steady. "It looked like it mattered," he added. Not a question, not small talk, just a statement filled with more weight than she expected. Then he tipped his hat and left, walking away without waiting for thanks. And she stood there, the shawl pressed against her chest, the scent of pine still clinging to the wool, wondering how a single returned garment could feel like the beginning of something she wasn't sure she had the courage to hope for. It began with the stare. One morning, as Evelyn swept the narrow landing outside the Mercantile's upper rooms, the second step gave a long, complaining groan beneath her foot. She paused, tested it again. It wobbled. That afternoon, Daniel appeared with a small canvas sack of tools slung over his shoulder, his sleeves rolled to the elbows and a pencil tucked behind one ear. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He just nodded toward the step and said, "Heard it from the street." He worked in silence, only pausing to ask for a bucket or brace. Evelyn brought him tea and a slice of apple pie. He ate it on the porch, kneeling beside the toolbox, chewing slow, as though the taste might tell him something important. The next morning he left a small jar of wild honey on the windowsill. No note, just the scent of mountain clover and pine. Over the next few weeks he returned, quietly. A cabinet hinge, a jammed drawer, a loose shutter rattling in the wind. He never overstayed, never lingered where he wasn't needed. And yet, the spaces he fixed began to feel less empty after he left. They spoke little, and when they did, the words were like smooth stones, few and chosen carefully. It was a Tuesday when Evelyn mentioned the book. She was dusting the shelf where she kept her borrowed volumes and said, without meaning to, "I always return to the millwright's wife. I suppose I like her stubbornness." Daniel didn't reply. Not then. But 3 days later, he handed her a copy as he stepped out from repairing the pantry door. It was worn, the spine soft from reading. Inside the front cover, in a spare, deliberate hand, he'd written, "You remind me of the heroine." She found him the next morning beneath the porch overhang, hammering a new board into the railing. "Why her?" she asked, holding the book close but not opening it. Daniel glanced up, the hammer resting against his shoulder. "Because she doesn't raise her voice to be heard," he said. "But she never backs down either." He said nothing more. He didn't need to. That night, Evelyn held the book like something fragile, something earned. She traced the handwriting with her finger until the ink smudged slightly. It was a simple thing. a gift of paper and spine and thought, but it pierced deeper than the cruelest whisper ever had. Still, beneath the warmth blooming in her chest, a cold question lingered like evening frost. Would he stay? Or would he leave like all the others, gently, quietly, without warning, and take this new softness with him? The morning was already warm when Evelyn opened the window to shake out the tablecloth. She expected silence, the rustle of leaves, the distant creak of wagon wheels. Instead, she heard the soft rhythm of wood against wood, not hurried, not idle, just measured and certain. She leaned out slightly and saw him, Daniel, sleeves rolled, hat tossed on the ground beside him, hammer in hand, mending the fence post that had leaned all winter like a tired old man. No one had asked him to fix it. She hadn't even mentioned it. He didn't glance up as she stepped onto the porch. The boards were cool under her bare feet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and lilac. For a moment she watched in silence, wondering if this was simply another kindness, another quiet act he would leave behind like the honey, the bookcase hinge that no longer squeaked. Then his voice rose, even and low, like a thought spoken aloud. "I've been thinking." He struck a nail cleanly, still not looking at her. "They say you were too old to be a bride." The words hung there, not cruel, not cautious, just plain, like weather. Evelyn felt the weight of them settle into her chest. The phrase she'd overheard, swallowed, carried, folded into herself like bad fabric. Her hands gripped the porch rail, fingers curling around the grain. Then he looked up. His eyes weren't kind in the soft way people used when they pitied. His eyes were steady. Calm. The kind of calm that came from standing inside storms and learning not to flinch. "But I've been asking God," he said, "to send someone with peace in her soul. Not the loud kind, the kind that listens, the kind that stays." He stepped closer, closing the distance with slow certainty. His boots didn't crush the early daisies along the path. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I saw you help that little girl when no one else noticed. I saw you sit alone and still smile at folks who barely met your eyes, and I thought—" He paused, hands at his sides now. "Lord, that's everything I ever prayed for." Evelyn couldn't speak. Her throat closed around the words that wanted to reach him. She wasn't trembling from fear this time, but from something more tender, a quiet unraveling inside her chest where sorrow had long been stitched in thick, invisible thread. For once, she didn't feel seen as a burden, a leftover. She felt seen as a wish. The morning of the wedding came without ceremony. No thunder of carriages, no procession of dresses rustling like paper. Just the hush of sunlight filtering through clouds and the gentle murmur of townsfolk gathering in the garden behind the chapel, where lilacs leaned over the fence as if they, too, wanted a better view. Evelyn stood alone for a moment beneath the branches of a blooming dogwood, the pale blossoms framing her face like lace. Her dress wasn't new, but it was clean and mended with care. The shawl around her shoulders was the same her mother once wore to Sunday meetings, and across the bodice of her gown, stitched in subtle thread, was the blue ribbon, the one she had folded into a drawer on the night Henry walked away. Now it rested where it had always belonged, near her heart. There was no preacher with booming voice, no string quartet, no maidens strewing petals, just the wind, the scent of lilac, and Daniel Reeves standing at the end of the garden path in his best shirt and his calmest gaze. He didn't smile wide or try to hide nerves. He simply watched her approach as though he had spent his whole life waiting for this one quiet moment. The ceremony was brief, spoken not in grandeur but in truth. The townsfolk shifted on their feet, wiping eyes with kerchiefs not out of spectacle, but out of something more intimate. the recognition of two people who had been weathered by life and still dared to love. Even the girls from the train station came. They stood toward the back, dresses too short, faces flushed with the shame of remembered cruelty. When Evelyn passed them after the vows, she didn't look away. She smiled, not to scold, not to gloat, but to forgive, and in doing so, left them rooted to the grass, their laughter long gone. Later, in the soft glow of lantern light, Evelyn and Daniel danced in the kitchen of her small upstairs lodging. The room smelled of bread and fresh flowers. The radio didn't work, so he hummed low while they swayed, her hands light on his shoulders, his breath warm against her hair. "You make growing old feel like a blessing," he whispered against her ear. She closed her eyes. She didn't respond right away. She just let it settle. Deep, steady, like rain into dry earth. And for the first time in decades, she didn't feel like someone people looked past. She felt seen. She felt chosen. The town never spoke of Henry Whitlock again, and neither did Evelyn. Not out of bitterness, no, that was never her way, but because some names simply stopped mattering when life chose better ones. She didn't erase him. She outgrew the need to remember. In silence, she offered him the only judgment he truly earned: irrelevance. People noticed. Not all at once, but in those quiet, unguarded glimpses that speak louder than gossip. They saw her walking down Main Street with a fresh loaf of bread tucked under her arm and laughter still lingering in the lines of her face. They saw her husband, the quiet carpenter who once leaned against the church walls like a man waiting for permission to live again, reading aloud to her from the porch in the evenings, his voice low, steady, brushing the air like a second breeze as she embroidered in her lap, or simply closed her eyes to listen. Daniel would kiss her palms sometimes, without announcement, and say, "These are hands of gold." She would laugh, not shyly, but like someone who'd finally come home to herself, like someone who'd been restored piece by piece, not through grand declarations, but through small, sacred gestures that accumulated like grace. The same women who had once whispered behind their hands about the old bride who got left now borrowed her soup recipes and asked after her roses. Evelyn gave freely. Advice, stories, thimbles, patience. She had more of all than most knew what to do with. But she gave without pride. Her dignity was quiet, like the dusk, always there, whether noticed or not. Her sister in Missouri wrote often, and Evelyn wrote back with ink-smudged joy. One letter began, "I wish you could feel what I feel right now. I wish you knew what it's like to be looked at with reverence instead of expectation." But the most telling words she never mailed. They lived inside the drawer beside her bed, where the blue ribbon lay folded, no longer hidden, no longer a symbol of rejection. Next to it, she placed a slip of paper in her own handwriting, delicate but unshaken. Too old to be a bride? No, just right to be loved the way I always deserved. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. It was not a note for anyone else. It was a seal on her story. Not a beginning, not an ending, but a truth finally allowed to breathe.